why is everyone so obsessed with this? Like, and it's interesting. Like, I'm glad you asked the question because it's like people are trying to take down Europe, calling it a museum. I'm like, come on, guys.
Oh.
I mean, when you look at the numbers, it paints a good picture, actually. VC funding in Europe reached about 30 billion the first half of 2024. That's a 12% increase to 2023. If the pace continues, I think 2024 will become the third most active year ever for VC funding in Europe. Obviously those 2021 years were insane across the board. Regionally, you're also seeing a lot of diversification. The UK has raised the most in total. I think it was 9.5 billion, but France has 4.3, and it's becoming an AI hub. And you look at DACH region and you're seeing tons of companies come out of there. And then of course the Nordics has produced a bizarrely disproportionate amount of unicorns. The New York Times just wrote a story about this the other day. And we're seeing big deals as well. In Q1 of 2024, I think Europe had 139 active unicorns, 4 new additions, Wave at the big Series C, Mistral's 640 million Series B round. There's a lot going on. And you have, talent flywheels emerging as well. For example, Spotify and Klarna alums have spawned 70 venture-backed companies in Stockholm from 2 companies. It's amazing. And so when you look at the kinds of companies that are being built in Europe, which are generally more capitally efficient, have better entry prices, there's often less competition in these local markets, and there's also diverse market opportunities. It's not surprising that when you, again, look at the numbers over a 10 and 15-year time horizon, European VC funds have yielded higher net IRR compared to North American ones. So if you're after hype and number of deals and valuations, stick in the US. If you want to make money for your LPs and yourselves and also work with some of the most amazing founders ever, Europe's a great place to be.
Welcome to Sorcery. I'm your host, Molly O'Shea. Today, we have Molly Alter, partner at Northzone, a $1.2 billion fund with around $4 billion AUM. Molly joined Northzone in 2023, bringing with her an impressive track record of 12 investments from her time at Insight Partners and Index Ventures. Her portfolio includes notable successes such as Lightrix, Glia, Tractable, and Frame.io, which she sourced and served on the board of before their $1.2 billion sale to Adobe. Based in New York, Molly focuses on vertical SaaS and vertical AI across both the US and Europe for early and growth stage companies. This is a really fun conversation, and we get into a little bit of the heat between Europe and the US, as well as all the fun that comes with AI. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Molly. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Molly. Molly squared.
I know. Actually, when I was able to get you on, I was thinking, maybe I'll just have a podcast and it'll just be interviews with Mollies in tech. This could be fun.
There aren't that many of us, but there are a lot of really cool Mollies from history, like Unsinkable Molly Brown, kind of a legend.
I don't know who that is, but
she was this woman on the Titanic, and she was supposed to die, but then she managed to find her way to a lifeboat, and there's some crazy story about her.
Oh, amazing. Okay, I love that. Well, thanks again for coming on. You were one of the first people I met in venture in New York City years and years ago. I think at the time you were at Insight Partners, and since then you've had quite the journey. You went to London, you worked for Index, and then now you're back in the States at Northzone. So I'd love to just start there and maybe first get 4 takeaways over the last 8 years of working in venture at various funds, what you've learned.
Yeah, well, it's been an amazing journey. And as for takeaways, I mean, maybe one relates to what you just said, which is, wherever you go and however many years pass, your network follows you. So yeah, we met, I think, back in 2016. And I found that actually some of my strongest connections in this industry are people who, I've known for a long time. And even if you move firms or move geographies, that network can be really sticky. And people have great memories. So for me, I try to make every interaction really count. And I think that's probably evidenced in this conversation now that we're talking again so many years later that people stick around. Another takeaway I've had, I guess, over the years, it's sort of a cliche, but I do think that people at, any firm are the most important thing. I've been at large firms. I've been at smaller ones. I've been at focused firms that are really focused on their brand. I've been at firms that don't care at all about their brand. And these things for me are all sort of, interesting, but almost like necessary sufficient conditions rather than necessary conditions. Like it's great if a fund is massive and has a bunch of dollars, has this amazing brand, but even if it has all those things and the people are terrible, not worth anyone's time. So that's been a really interesting lesson. And then, I think both of us are not, we're a little bit on the younger side, and especially when we started out, we had to sort of build our own moats, and that's something that I think about a lot in VC, especially for younger ones. There are so many opportunities to differentiate yourselves, and one of the easiest opportunities I found is to actually look into the boring and complicated stuff that more senior GPs don't want to look into. And then, they turn around and there's a space that gets interesting, like AI, for instance. A lot of people didn't want to go deep into AI 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And there were a lot of young people that did the hard work of getting smart on that. And then the GPs would say, hey, and I'm not even one of those people. Like, I think I was sort of middle of the pack. I wasn't the earliest adopter there, but a GP would say, hey, I don't understand this. Get me up to speed. And what an amazing opportunity for someone to then be, really expert in that field. And then finally, there's a concept that I'm obsessed with about, our biases and knowing our biases. And I think that that's been something over the years that I've cared a lot about, is just really being intellectually honest on, how I think about the world and my own shortcomings. And everyone has their own biases. There's things like discovery bias, which is sort of the notion of, I found this investment, so I love it, and it's personal to me. Or there's sunk cost bias, which is really common as well. I spent 3 weeks in due diligence, so I love it. Or, kind of angst bias of, I haven't done a deal in a year, so I love this deal. Whereas if you had just done a deal, you probably wouldn't give it a second glance. So I love unpacking these biases. And that's been something over the years that has been, a real learning of mine, is that we all have them and you can't really get rid of them. But if you're aware of them, it's half the battle.
Very insightful. It's a good way to start. Maybe another touch point for getting your insights. You've lived in New York, you went to London. Love to get your stance on that. So do you travel back to London for work still? Any surprises from your time living there? What kind of perspective did you get?
Yeah, so I lived in London for 3 years, and I grew up in New Jersey. I was born in New York. I'd been sort of an East Coaster, so London's not a crazy culture shock because they speak English, but it was for me a little bit of a culture shock. I think one of the big differences I noticed was just that people there have almost like a split personality syndrome. I hope I don't offend my London friends, but this is more the cliche. Like, there's sort of this daytime persona of London or British people in general, where they're very, very polite. They love to wait in line. They call it queuing. I guess we did call it queuing here sometimes too. They say like, hello, love, when you go to the coffee shop. But then at night, you have this pub culture, which is super belligerent and like very, very intense. And that delta between daytime and nighttime in London is like shocking to me when I moved there. It was like werewolf transition. But I really grew to love the city. I still go there, probably every 6 weeks. And whenever I do, I always kind of hit up my London spots and eat a lot of food and try to make the most of it.
Amazing. So throughout our conversation, we'll cover a bunch of different things. We'll go through your background and the theses, as well as Northzone and Northzone strategy. And then we'll go into a couple more verticalized approaches, software for hardware, as well as vertical SaaS. Before we get into that, I still want to break down your background and your experience as an investor, because I think you've had great experience. You've worked for some pretty mega shops, and I know some of them hire right out of school. Some of them are really hard to get into. It's very competitive. But from your experience, being at these large shops, like, what do you think the biggest difference is in your experience in venture? Was it more institutional versus like maybe like a scrappy emerging manager? Do you have more resources? Do you have to write more reports? Like, what kind of difference do you think there really is?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously there are a number of dimensions in which firms can kind of differ in their approach. There's sourcing, there's diligence, there's picking, there's support, there's like back office. And you would think, and I had thought that there would be a correlation between sort of the size of the fund and how folks did those things. For instance, I kind of thought, okay, a huge headcount place, they're going to have tons of lawyers doing everything in-house. And, what are all those people doing? But actually, these decisions on, how to put your headcount to work are really, really strategic. And they are often surprising. And so I've, been at a huge firm where we had the vast majority of headcount focused on sourcing insight. And they're very proud of this model. They say, our differentiation is we are the best sourcers. We have almost perfect coverage. And they had very few in-house lawyers. They, used an outsourced firm, and on the back office, also very lean. And then, other places are much lighter on sourcing and, in terms of headcount, and have a ton of, data science or technical resources. Northzone, for instance, we have a pretty even split, maybe a little over-indexed on the platform side as well, because, we care a lot about helping our portfolio companies post-investment. And so to understand how these firms work, it's really important to dig in, not, just the overall size doesn't tell you that much, but when you dig into the actual composition of the team, you really learn what life at those firms will be like. And, for me, I love sourcing. I love diligence. I hate legal work. Don't like to do it at all. And so, firms that have been a good fit for me, map to that. But knowing this stuff going in is super important.
To dig deeper into your exact thesis and your investment strategy, you've had a number of awesome hits, especially for someone who is young. I'd love to know, what are you investing in? What's the stage of check?
Yeah, so for check size, we start at 2.5 million at the seed stage and go all the way up to 50, 60 million at the growth stage. The real bread and butter is, 10 to 20. That's where the majority of our checks happen. But I do have a background in growth investing, so seeing a lot there. And sometimes we do a rare, very early stage investment as well. But in terms of, thesis and where I'm spending my time, I'm thinking a lot these days about vertical AI, and really, the opportunity there being more exciting than sort of horizontal or even foundational layers in AI at the moment. First of all, I think a lot of the foundational layer investing has been done and will continue, but going forward, there's this really, really interesting notion that the one drag on on AI is that it lacks differentiation sometimes. And, it can often be sort of, this or that, and maybe OpenAI will come in and build something themselves. And so what I see as the big opportunity with vertical software is you have these spaces like legal tech or construction, manufacturing, software for hardware, healthcare, that are very specific, and you can create this sort of defensibility through leveraging that specificity. And you have founders who are understanding these markets really well. They're building tools that are very closely aligned with customer needs, leveraging AI, but they have actually a moat because they're able to integrate into sort of the generic workflow SaaS tools that have been around for a while. So it's like, instead of an AI that would just, let's say you're in a doctor's appointment and there's an AI tool that transcribes the conversation between the doctor and the patient, that's super cool. But if that AI can then integrate with the doctor's workflow and help them prescribe the medication, and then remind the doctor to follow up with the patient, and then make sure that the patient gets billed appropriately, and sort of like completing that stack, that to me is what's truly defensible and what's truly exciting about the promise of AI. So I'm spending a lot of time there, and then also, we're looking at some things in the SMB stack as well, which have been pretty interesting. But it's been a fun season.
Hey, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsor. Sorcery is brought to you by Archer. I'm genuinely amazed at what Archer has been able to accomplish. Archer's goal is to transform urban travel, replacing 60 to 90-minute car commutes with estimated 10 to 20-minute electric air taxi flights. They are safe, sustainable, low noise, and cost competitive with ground transportation. Archer's Midnight is a piloted 4-passenger aircraft designed to perform rapid back-to-back flights with minimal charge time between flights. Learn more about how Archer is set to open up a new world of opportunity for passengers by providing safe and efficient access to people, places, and events across the communities they live. Visit archer.com.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying Sorcery, I'm excited to tell you about a new show called This Won't Last. The show includes Logan Bartlett of Redpoint, Keith Raboy at Khosla, Kevin Ryan at Alicorp, and Zach Weinberg, a biotech founder and investor. They're not here to promote a portfolio company or share marketing blurbs. If you were curious about what VCs talk about in group chats when the cameras are normally gone, they're releasing footage for a short time. A link is in the description. Listen wherever you get your podcast.
And so what have been your most impactful investments to date?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk about a couple of the ones that are a little bit more mature now so that I don't intimidate any of the current founders by speaking too highly of them too soon. Frame.io is one that exited to Adobe for just over $1 billion a couple years ago. That was one that was really impactful for me because it sort of showed how, as an investor, personal interest can map to real, financial opportunities. I had sourced that company because I'm a weekend warrior video creator. I guess similar to you, I do like making things, and I made like sort of a mockumentary film series with my family about it's a little bit niche, but it's about the world of competitive charades, which doesn't really exist. Anyway, I was playing around with, I know it's
What?
fun. My sister and I are really good at charades. And we were like, what if there was like an Olympics of charades, or like that we were like the Venus and Serena Williams of charades. And so we created this whole universe around that, and it's taken very seriously. Like my mom plays our coach, and anyway.
Do you have like a time? I'm curious about this. Do you have like a timer? Like what's involved?
Yeah, definitely a timer for sure. There's like strict rules, obviously no talking, but you also can't be pointing to things, and the clues have to be done in a certain way. They need to be like accessible enough, but everyone hates an easy clue. So we made a mockumentary, and the actors in it are all in my family, and now it's a series. I have like 3 episodes out. So I was doing this on the weekends. I obviously played around with a lot of tools. Frame.io is one that had been flagged to me by another creator friend, and so I started using them. It's like really early days. Anyway, I ended up building a relationship with Emery, the founder there, and we led their Series C, and very soon thereafter they got acquired. It was a great markup and just a really great experience. But yeah, lesson there being that sometimes there are moments in this job where you have to just like roll up your sleeves and do your homework, and it seems really hard when you're going and understanding how LLMs really work for the first time. Like that wasn't my absolute passion project, but it's important to do. And then there are other moments when the things that genuinely interest you actually do end up mapping to real business opportunities, and how lucky we are to get to invest behind those trends sometimes as well. So that was a really fun one. And then another one called Glia, which I invested in, again, quite a few years now, that has scaled really well, is essentially a software for credit unions to allow their customers to communicate and, kind of customer service, but digitally forward, to communicate with their credit unions and, perform any transactions that they need to digitally without having to go into the credit union or call up a phone number. And that one was really interesting because it was sort of my first exposure into vertical SaaS, and how these things that sound super boring, no offense to Glia, but like, okay, credit unions communicating with their customers, like who cares, can actually be so interesting when you get into the nitty gritty of it. Just seeing the power of founders who really understand their target market. I think that was sort of a nugget for me and got me really interested in the vertical SaaS world at large.
Okay, we might need to like link up with someone in LA and sell your charades mockumentary series to like Netflix or Amazon, because I feel like that would be really fun to watch.
There's a lot of like training montages with different hand signals.
I'm sure like it just sounds like you would have a fun time watching that. But to more seriously, okay, that's great. Those are awesome companies, and Frame.io is a real winner, and congrats again. I'm curious, I guess, within those companies and throughout your time, you've been in very heavily sourcing environments. Insight, like you mentioned, is known for being kind of like a cold call center for just sourcing and dialing and dialing. And so you've gotten exposed to many founders on top of the ones that you've backed that have had huge successes. So what I'm getting to is, given that and given your direct exposure, what insights have you gotten from these kinds of founders and what it takes to build a world-class company and a world-class CEO?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe actually just using the same companies I just talked about to keep it consistent. Like one thing I learned from Emery, who's the CEO of Frame.io, is that there's no match for intensity. You need it. And he once gave me this really powerful analogy where he said, if I was training for the Olympics of figure skating, nobody would ask me, do you have work-life balance? Like I would be figure skating all day long. Everything I eat, every time I go to bed, it all relates back to my figure skating career. And so I'm trying to be not a world-class figure skater, but I'm trying to build a world-class company. And so my entire life revolves around this. Like every action I do throughout the day is building towards this vision. And I thought that intensity was super powerful. And I've seen it across a number of founders since then, but it is rare. And when you see it, I try to invest. And maybe, yeah, from Glia, learning there is kind of what I mentioned before around understanding your customers. Like I think CEOs sometimes get a bad rap because they like to grandstand or, talk. And oftentimes, they might even have egos, but actually the best CEOs are the ones who maybe they have an ego. Who cares if you have an ego? But they put it aside and really listen to their customers. And it all comes back to that. And that's another quality that I find to be a huge green flag, is just someone who, sure, they have their own opinions, but at the end of the day, they're going to be data driven and they actually know how to collect the right qualitative data from customers to inform the best decision making. That to me screams invest.
Right. Objectives driven, clear headed, clear minded, and just execution focused.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so shifting now to Northzone strategy, because I'd love to get into this. This brings up some fun topics. The firm itself was founded in 1996 in Europe. It's got strong connectivity to the region and a strategic advantage there. I'd love to learn more about the fund, when it was founded, how, by who, and what its current AUM is.
Yeah, so Northzone was founded in 1996. We like to say it was founded on the shores of Norway, which isn't that much of an exaggeration. It was like really out there in Norway. And, it was founded by former entrepreneurs. And so they were looking for founders that they would have wanted to work with themselves. And they really did pioneer this idea of being founder friendly because they had this backstory. And that was, long before it became such a thing. But if you can imagine, the shores of Norway in 1996, there wasn't exactly a lot of tech opportunity. So I think they had, a bit of a sit down where they said, look, we can either be a local Norwegian firm, and live that life, or we can go global from day one and have that be our DNA. And they chose the latter. If you fast forward to today, we're 4 billion AUM, with offices throughout the US where I'm based, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and we still kind of hold to that founder friendliness, but also we have some truly Scandinavian values that have infiltrated even our US settings. And one of those values is meritocracy. And meritocracy, it's helped us over the years avoid hype cycles, and focus on things, technologies and business models with real substance. It also, I think, maybe even more importantly, it helps us avoid internal politics. And that is very special. I don't know, I'm sure you've had this experience or talked with folks who complain about politics in VC. It's like a real thing. And
Yeah.
It shouldn't be at all, because VC has real metrics. Like we have numbers on a page that we're showing to our LPs that we are accountable for. And obviously, sometimes those investing cycles can be long. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the numbers to really be clear. But VC firms should not be as political as they are. If you're a Broadway show, I get why you have politics, because, who knows how good someone is on stage, and that's very subjective. But Northzone does a really good job of saying, hey, we are a meritocratic place. We need to put our egos aside and focus on deliverables. How much money are we making for our LPs? What is our founder NPS, an extremely clear deliverable? And what are our inputs looking like? How hard are we working? The people we invest in, like I was saying, Emory's, they're spending their whole lives devoted to this. And so we owe it to them and to ourselves to really put in that intensity of work. How does that marry with like the Scandinavian work-life balance? Everyone figures it out for themselves, but I do think those values have really resonated and persisted since 1996.
And what's the makeup of the firm split between the US team and the Europe team?
Yeah, from an investing perspective, we're anywhere between, usually definitely 50+% Europe, and then sometimes it's up there for the US as well, but it's a pretty geographically distributed split. And from a team perspective, the same. Our New York team is getting large, which is great. We've got a lot of horsepower. And then we all try to kind of fly over and see each other every 8 weeks, so that we can have a very cohesive and high quality in-person partner meeting. And then we have the Zoom ones as well. So yeah, it's a good setup.
Are you able to focus on global reach, or do you focus mostly on US?
So I spend about 75 to 80% of my time on the US, and really only looking at European companies when they fit in a sector that has been a thesis area for me. So for instance, I've looked at a lot of European companies in the revenue cycle management space, or software for hardware, or government procurement. And that's because those are themes that I've explored in the US, and then there are often relevant businesses abroad as well. We're pretty evenly split between US and Europe, with maybe a slight emphasis on Europe from a percentage dollars standpoint. But the two, thematically work really well together. So for instance, in Scandinavia, mental health was actually a thing long before it was in the US. They're so progressive over there. And so people were taking care of their mental health, and it was destigmatized. Whereas in the United States, it was still kind of, this is, mid 2000s, it was still crawling towards that. But that observation helped us to identify and invest in Spring Health long before the company blew up. And we led their Series A thinking if the Scandinavians are so evolved on this stuff, clearly that's going to come around the corner here. And there's this massive opportunity for modern outcomes-based mental health care to have an impact in the US market. And selling into employers was also a relatively novel business model at the time that we understood to be powerful. And so that was a European observation that led to a US investment. And the opposite happens all the time as well. We'll have, observations here on medical scribing, which took off. I don't know why I'm talking so much about healthcare, but medical scribing took off early in the US with companies like Abridge and DeepScribe. And we saw how quickly those businesses were able to grow, and invested in a company in Europe doing the same called Tandem Health. So that interconnectivity between our offices enables us to look around corners, and also gives us a breadth of experience when helping those founders navigating international expansion and navigating new market opportunities that might exist somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the US at that moment.
So this has worked out really well for you and your team. You guys have gotten to 4 billion AUM so far. However, to challenge that, the VC world, Silicon Valley, loves to put down Europe. It's a fun debate, and there's real data there as well. But I'd love to get it from your perspective, especially in this separate niche that is VC. We're the innovation class. We're supposed to help create new technologies and integrate into people's lives, make them much more efficient and better and fun. But just to lay it all out from your perspective, given you've spent a considerable amount of time there, what are the current trends of VC dollars, funds, companies, and success stories that have come out of the region?
Yeah, I'm almost why is everyone so obsessed with this? And it's interesting. I'm glad you asked the question, because people are trying to take down Europe, calling it a museum. I'm like, come on, guys. I mean, when you look at the numbers, it paints a good picture, actually. VC funding in Europe reached about 30 billion the first half of 2024. That's a 12% increase to 2023. If the pace continues, I think 2024 will become the third most active year ever for VC funding in Europe. Obviously those 2021 years were insane across the board. And regionally, you're also seeing a lot of diversification. The UK has raised the most in total. I think it was 9.5 billion. But France has 4.3, and it's becoming an AI hub. And you look at DACH region and you're seeing tons of companies come out of there. And then of course the Nordics has produced a bizarrely disproportionate amount of unicorns. The New York Times just read a story about this the other day. And we're seeing big deals as well. In Q1 of 2024, I think Europe had 139 active unicorns, 4 new additions. So Wave at the big Series C, Mistral's 640 million Series B round. There's a lot going on. And you have, talent flywheels emerging as well. For example, Spotify and Klarna alums have spawned 70 venture-backed companies in Stockholm from 2 companies. It's amazing. But I do understand. So, the rub on it is that when you compare those numbers to the US numbers, they are definitely smaller, and the US might seem more aggressive. My perspective is that we are in the business of making money for our LPs. And that doesn't always mean investing in markets with the greatest number of deals or the highest valuations. I want to invest in markets with low valuations. That's great. And so when you look at the kinds of companies that are being built in Europe, which are generally more capitally efficient, have better entry prices, there's often less competition in these local markets, and there's also diverse market opportunities. It's not surprising that when you, again, look at the numbers over a 10 and 15-year time horizon, European VC funds have yielded higher net IRR compared to North American ones. So if you look, if you're after hype and number of deals and valuations, stick in the US. If you want to make money for your LPs and yourselves and also work with some of the most amazing founders ever, Europe's a great place to be. And I'm lucky I got to do both. So I feel spoiled in that regard.
Not a bad sell.
That's my hard pitch. Come on over.
Love that. To counter that again. So I'm wondering, right? Like degrowth and decline is a real concern. And there are some deeper and like more specific nods to that, whether it's free speech, access to the internet, energy dependence, power, all of these kinds of really complicated geopolitical risks that come with the region. From your perspective, like how much of that really caps the ceiling for growth that you think Europe can achieve?
It's a great question. I think there is this reputation in Europe that there are a lot of restrictions. There's GDPR, there is, energy restrictions, and then also there's the restriction that comes from, to your point, declining birth rates in many of these geographies. And so those are all very real challenges that need to be addressed. But at the same time, I do think that with restriction can come greater innovation. Perhaps, the best analogy for this, stay with me, is vegan food. I'm not a vegan myself, but I actually love vegan food. I think it's delicious. And some of the best chefs in the world, like Daniel Hume, see cooking vegan food. Sure, it's an environmental stance, but actually as a way to inspire himself to innovate and be creative. And I think there's this, this emergence of fresh ideas and rethinking of concepts that comes from restrictions being in place. And some of that is, really easy to explain. So like environmental and safety regulations, they drive innovation in cleaner and safer technologies. We invested in a company called Flower, which is integrating battery energy storage systems into the grid, essentially, allowing electric car fleets or home battery owners or data centers or solar parks to optimize their needs, and it also uses AI to manage the supply and the demand. If we had just fossil fuels up, the wazoo and had no need to diversify from that opportunity wouldn't exist, and the company's growing super quickly. So our business is about change, and regulation can feel like the most depressing kind of change, but it still is change. And it creates a lot of new opportunities for innovators to come in and build something new and vacuums for folks to fill.
That's really interesting. People do argue that restrictions in some capacity do create more meaningful innovation.
There are some that are more, I think the energy ones are really easy. There are some that are more complex, like GDPR, which first of all has now become a global standard. So I don't think it's specific as much to Europe anymore, but that definitely has inhibited many tech businesses. So there's always nuance and shades of gray.
To shift more into your areas of investment, your team put out a really interesting piece that caught my eye because, I'm here in LA. I'm right next to Hard Tech World, El Segundo, all of the big companies like Anduril, Hadrian, SpaceX. They're all here. And so your team put out a piece on software for hardware. And there was one particular quote that caught my eye and I thought it was great. So I'll just read it out. You wrote, "The technology industry has gotten incredibly good at building software that helps other people build software. There are countless coding copilots, data logging, observability tools, and debugging programs that are multi-billion-dollar companies in their own right." So Molly, why hasn't hardware development experienced a similar revolution with supportive software?
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons that we suspect. First of all, software engineers know their own problems really well. And so they therefore can more intuitively build solutions for themselves. And then they often end up releasing those to the world. So for instance, a lot of the top software companies were started by ex-FANG engineers who had these incredible internal tools and wanted to start businesses and release them more broadly. Example being ML ops or data engineering companies that were started by Meta engineers who worked with PyTorch in the late 2010s. And so that dynamic just doesn't exist in the hardware world and is a reason why it's not a reason why software for hardware hasn't happened. It's a reason why software for software happened so quickly. But another reason is actually more structural to the hardware industry. And that is that they have these large incumbents that are really difficult to rip and replace. And it's structural because these are physical processes that they're doing. And so a software team can really easily start using a new task management tool or a debugging tool without having to change their desk. But a manufacturing or design team would have to really shift real world physical processes in order to adopt any kind of new tooling. And so that's why one of the reasons why you've had these incumbents stick around for so long, because change management is really, really complex. And then I think finally, a lot of the macro changes that are pushing manufacturing and hardware development teams towards greater efficiency have really picked up in the last couple of years. So, you have things like global onshoring, declining birth rates, which has more of an impact than you would think, and the threat of Chinese competition as well. These factors have lit a fire underneath manufacturing teams to push themselves on efficiency. And so that's a theme that leads me to believe that this space will see a lot more investment over time. But, those challenges I alluded to earlier are, they're real. And this is a hard space to crack, but the rewards will be very rich.
Yeah, it's been a fun new revolution because there is so much excitement around it. Like there is so much excitement. And it's not only from the startup side, but like growth stage companies having massive wins and just creating this ecosystem where you have people come out of them and then start new companies. Like you mentioned with software, it's people are leaving Anduril and starting companies. People are leaving SpaceX and starting companies. And by the way, they're not hardware companies. Like they actually want to solve some of the pain points in their workflow processes. And they know how much these kind of just add up over time and they compound. So it's been really exciting to watch. One of the challenges that I have with it, and maybe you've experienced this too, is the ecosystem just isn't really that rich yet. There are limited options, limited number of companies, limited number of like really excitable talent. And not only that, but okay, there's a huge dislocation in late stage capital for hardware companies and then maybe software for hardware companies. I'm sure like the sales cycles are somewhat similar. So I'm just curious to push on that like a little bit more. Where does the bullishness come from and the conviction?
Yeah, I mean, the reason people have stayed away for many years, again, it's real. Like it's crazy when you talk to these customers. they're using a wild set of resources. Like a lot of them are doing, jerry-rigged Excel setups combined with Jira, combined with scribbled notes that integrate with 1980s on-prem software, and it's run on an industrial computer. And so on one hand, it's like, wow, how do you get them out of that lifestyle? Because it's really, really entrenched. But also, the more optimistic side of me is like the power of moving this to the cloud, which will allow for all this, collaboration and compute capacity. It's super exciting, and the opportunity is there. But sort of like the difficulty of it and the promise are really intertwined. Like it wouldn't be so exciting if it hadn't been so hard over the years. And the reason it's so exciting now essentially is because there's all of this debt that hasn't been addressed, and it hasn't been addressed because it's really hard. So it's like a bit of a stew. But you have, really interesting data points from, the size of the prize as well. Like, Toyota, we found, pays MATLAB $50 million a year. Boeing pays Simulink and MATLAB hundreds of millions. Samsung has an 8-figure contract with Atlassian. Like these people spend on software. It's just about that, again, change management and getting them to spend on more modern software. But the good news is, and again, reason for excitement is that a lot of the leadership at these companies is turning over. There are older executives who grew up using certain softwares and they didn't want to rock the boat and change anything. But they're retiring, and they're aging out of the workforce. And there are these Gen X millennials who are replacing them, who are used to intuitive cloud-based collaborative software that they use even like at home, or like maybe they have a Notion with their husband. And they're like, why do I use this random stuff at work? And so that's sort of like part of the why now moment. But truthfully as well, the AI hype, had spared no industry. And there is a little bit of a component here where some of these hardware manufacturers are going into their budget meetings and, their board is saying, are you guys using AI? And they don't want to admit that they can't use AI because their underlying systems are Excel/Jira/scribbled notes. And so they're saying, okay, well, maybe now the time is right for us to adopt more modern kind of underlying workflow, cloud-based software. That's collaborative. And then we can add on the AI stuff and do all of that. So the why now, I think is really clear. The pace of execution, the pace of change is always the big question mark with these spaces. And, we've seen companies execute faster on that in recent months, which leads us to believe that acceleration will continue.
Are there any specific areas within software for hardware that you're keen on right now?
Quite a few. So I guess one would be simulation and CIE, which is computer assisted engineering tools. A lot of the current CIE tools really miss the mark on usability and scalability. They're often deployed on-prem, on industrial computers, and they're very compute constrained. They often lack interoperability as well. So we've heard that a lot of simulation engineers are basically running custom scripts just to maintain them, and they have very few integrations into computer system design and lifecycle management systems. They're on-prem, so they're not easily updated. They don't use any of the newer machine learning techniques, such as graph neural networks, hybrid physics models. Like this stuff gets a little bit technical, but basically simulation tools are going to have a moment, and AI is and will continue to come for them. And then also, there's really interesting opportunities within program management. These large hardware teams, they have kind of a smorgasbord of different ways that people use to track the program's development. And it's often not integrated. I think that the teams that best integrate them are actually F1. F1 is known to be really good at collaboration, and they use this thing called digital threads to make sure that everyone's sort of on the same page. It's actually like a very sophisticated technology. But one thing that's great about program management as sort of an entry point for software for hardware companies is that you can actually trial, because there's a smorgasbord, can't say that word, of different ways people are tracking their programs. You can actually just trial with a specific team. It'll be a lower contract size, but get them to be really successful. And then you can expand from there, and almost like a product-led growth kind of way without having to be evaluated for a massive, multi-million-dollar contract off the bat. Because again, that can be a challenge in this industry. They're paying these huge contracts and they don't want to give that to a startup. But if you start with program management, there's a little bit of an easier land and expand there. So those are just a couple of the opportunities, but there's also a lot in firmware development as well. As we mentioned, MATLAB and Simulink have had this stranglehold for decades, and that is due to change as well.
Got it. And as we take a step back and talk about broader SaaS, specifically in workflow SaaS, public multiples are now sitting between 5 to 6x, down from their 20x on average in 2021, which is just also crazy. But if SaaS is trending in this direction, why are you so bullish on it in general?
Yeah, so on the one hand, like people are saying SaaS is over, it's all AI. The multiples do kind of reflect that. Growth rates are slowing. In 2024, the average growth rate for public SaaS companies is expected to be 16%, super low, like relative to history. Tax are rising for SaaS. There's more competition. Buyers are more stringent on budgets, sometimes to make room for AI. And there was this unrealistic exuberance in 2021 that everything would become SaaS or a quote unquote platform play. I still don't even know what a platform really means. And I've been an investor for like almost 10 years. But anyway, so there was this unrealistic exuberance. And I think, people have sort of come back to earth on that. But my belief is that the reports of SaaS's death have been greatly exaggerated, to quote Mark Twain. I think what workflow SaaS is like the most interesting part of AI. I think AI, as I mentioned before, it's hypey and it's really powerful. And if you were to think of a car, AI is the engine, and it's like this flashy new engine that everyone wants. But if you don't have the car doors, you don't have the steering wheel, and you don't have the transmission, like how are you going to deliver that engine? And so I think workflow SaaS is the delivery mechanism that will allow AI to actually, keep its promise. And it also helps these AI companies combat some of their main criticisms, which is that they lack differentiation. They're thin GPT wrappers. They're commoditized. You're not as commoditized when you have the tooling around that AI engine that gets people highly engaged, becomes a system of record, and a system of engagement instead of just, oh, cool, it summarized all my notes. So yeah, I've been, calling this kind of new wave of SaaS, hybrid SaaS, because it isn't just pure workflow SaaS anymore. It's SaaS, but it's also AI, and it's a little bit of fintech, and sometimes there's like a B2B marketplace thrown in there, and it's a really exciting field that I'm definitely going to be investing behind in the coming years.
Are there any specific companies that you have in mind that best exemplify this?
There's one we invested in more than 6 months ago now called GovDash, which I think is the perfect example of a hybrid SaaS company. And GovDash, it's in the government procurement space. For those that don't know about the space, it's totally crazy. 36% of US GDP is spent on government spend. There's $750 million of spend last year that went through federal contractors. And if you're a federal contractor, every single piece of business you do goes through a formal RFP. And that's actually a good thing. Like if, there's a federal courthouse down the street and they need to paint it, they're not just going to be able to say, oh, hey, I've got a buddy that has a painting company, I'm going to give him that contract. Like, this is our taxpayer dollars. They should be running a formal, really, rigid and deep RFP process to find the best contractor for the job. But if you're a contractor, if you're a painting company, you want to be out there painting courthouses. You don't want to be spending your time going through like a 75-page government RFP contract and putting together the case for why you're the best painting company in all of Brooklyn. And so what GovDash does is they provided an AI solution that, you upload the RFP that you want to complete. You have a sort of embedding space where all of your past performance lives, and all of the other RFPs you've won or lost are in this space. And then they automatically create a very compliant outline to the RFP you're trying to respond to. And it takes 2 hours instead of 2 weeks for them to to do this process. And so that was super exciting for contractors. They were like, get this into my hands. And AI was the wedge. But if they only did that, I think it's an interesting market opportunity, but there might be an upper limit. What makes GovDash so powerful is they also have all of these other more traditional SaaS tools that help contractors run their business and collaborate with other subcontractors and also keep track of their projects. And eventually, maybe down the road, they'll have kind of procurement and billing functionality that allows them to actually bill the government and go out and buy their paintbrushes and charge it back to where it should be charged. So yeah, it's not SaaS, it's not only AI, it's never going to be only fintech, but the combination of these things together makes for a truly defensible, resilient business that I think is going to be really large.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's a really good application. Okay, so we covered a lot today, Molly. Thank you so much for all of your time. I usually like to close out on a positive note, and this could be as random or as work specific as you want. But what are you most looking forward to in the next 12 months, end of this year?
Oh, that's an easy one because I'm getting married in May.
Congrats!
Yeah, I'm gonna do it in France. My fiance is from the French Alps, so we're planning a whole French wedding. Which actually, pro tip: do a wedding that is destination where your partner is from, because I have to do very little of the planning because I don't speak fluent French. It's genius.
That is a great tip.
Yeah, he's been a champ, and we're both super excited. So that's probably the easy answer.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Molly. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Molly, and great to catch up again.